Bill Clinton actually taught me what the First Amendment means, which I know sounds odd coming from a journalist, but until I had the conversation with Bill Clinton, I had not had the big journalism epiphany.
Every morning at 9 a.m., WPSD News Director Perry Boxx banters with Chief Meteorologist Trent Okerson about the day's forecast. He asks about rain chances for walking his rescue dog Hero and complains when there's a chilly Saturday or a stormy Sunday.
What happened was the KKK reared its ugly head again in the state, and Little Rock had this tradition of being less than progressive when it came to race relations. The Elaine race riot comes to mind, the Little Rock school desegregation crisis, and all kinds of other stuff that I could bore you running down.
Reporters pitch their stories for the day. On the rare occasion that a reporter pitches a day story, say a story about National Bean Day or National Mental Health Awareness Week, Perry cocks an imaginary shotgun. He says we cover impacts, not events. He gets fired up about government transparency and the First Amendment, but he's not above being swayed by a cute animal story. First and foremost, though, Perry believes in holding powerful people accountable.
Anyway, the Klan guy up in northwest Arkansas named Tom Robb invited David Black, who was the Grand Poobah Klan guy in Alabama, and David Duke, who was the Grand whatever he is down in Louisiana, to Little Rock they marched in Little Rock, and then they were going to have a rally at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and they wanted to use the auditorium there, and nobody wanted to sign off on, they could have it. So it became a matter of controversy whether they were going to be allowed to use the hall. It ended up on the governor's desk.
The governor at that time, future President Bill Clinton. At a Tuesday morning news conference, Clinton announces he'll allow them to lease the facility for their meeting.
News conference was over, and he started back to his office, and this was a different time. I just followed him back to his office. You tried that now, you get wrestled to the ground. But I just followed him back to his office, and it was just chewing him out. Like, you can't do this. And, I reminded him all of the stuff. And he to his credit, he listened to me. It wasn't the first time I'd, had that kind of conversation with, but he listened to me and all that. And then he just looked at me and he said, "Perry." And keep in mind, this guy taught constitutional law. He looked at me and he said, "Perry, the First Amendment is not just for us and the people who agree with us." And it just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks.
With a career in news that spans half a century, Perry's a living encyclopedia of the shifting trends and forces that have shaped journalism since the 1970s. This week on the Crossroads Suncast, from airlifted videotape to cable news, the internet and social media, the state of journalism then, now, and in the future. I'm Bryce Patterson.
I was 10 years old when John Kennedy was assassinated, and my mother had remarried a military man. We were living on a military base, Fort Riley in Kansas. And I was sitting in a fourth grade class with, it was, my twin brother and I, and the principal came into the room with the teacher, and, you could tell something was going on, and they just told us the president had been shot and that we were all to go straight home. And of course, school was on the military base. Custer Hill Elementary was the name of it. And it was the only time I saw my stepfather wearing a sidearm. And everybody on that military base was armed because nobody knew, whether the Soviets were going to blow us up. Remember we had the Cuban Missile Crisis and all of that. And it was just a very powerful time. And my mother, to her everlasting credit, told my brother and I to sit down in front of the television set and watch the funeral procession. I mean, everything was, you know, it may have been the first really big television event. And she told us to sit down there and watch. And she said, I'll never forget this. It's like that yesterday. She said, "This will be important to you later." And by God, it was. I really remember it very clearly, you know, the horseless rider, you know, with the boots turned, and,
Yeah.
you know, it kind of got a little frisky there in the procession. I mean, everybody's seen the video. And,
Yeah.
John doing the salute. Anyway, I remember that real clearly. And I remember in the 5th grade, we moved back to Arkansas, which is where I'm from originally. My father went to Korea, and we moved back. And I remember in the 5th grade, and I don't know why, but for some reason I was watching television, and it was, you know, it was 1963. And all the civil rights stuff was happening, you know. And I happened to be watching the television news and seeing all of this, and I'm going, what is all of this? You know, why are they hosing black people and children, and what's that all about? And then it struck me that I was living in a town that had no black people in it.
Yeah.
You know, and the N word was pretty casually used. And, you know, at that point I told my mother, you know, I watched a little bit of that, and I told her we can't use that word, you know. I remember that real clearly too. You know, I've told people before that as a journalist, I'm a product of the civil rights movement in Vietnam and Watergate. And those were all just, you know, powerful things. It was a different time. And then, you know, and they shot Bobby Kennedy, and they shot Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers, and, you know, the civil rights workers in Mississippi, Philadelphia, Mississippi. And, you know, it just, it was a lot, you know. The 60s and 70s were a dramatic time in America. Very, very much like today, a dramatic time.
So talk to me a little bit about your kind of initial steps into journalism. Was that something you studied in school, or how did you kind of get started?
I look back on it now, you know, I haven't done it since got my first job in radio when I was a junior in high school in 1971. And, you know, I was a disc jockey and all that, but my first real job in media, and I find this so ironic now, I was asked to do vacation relief proofreading for the Perry Daily Press, my hometown newspaper, which of course now is owned by Paxton Media, which owns our TV station, and the Paducah Sun, which I'm the executive editor for. And, you know, so, you know, here I am, I was a junior in high school, and editing, you know, doing the proofing, you know, for the Perry Daily Press, which was, to me, was a big deal, you know, in a small town at the time. And then shortly after that was in December of, well, it would have been 1970. And then in February of 71, the local radio station asked me to come down and interview for a job. The son of the owner of the station had heard me do an assembly at the high school and said, "You've got you know, a voice for radio. Why don't you go down and talk to Lloyd Emmert, the general manager?" And that's how I got into it. But, you know, I didn't set out to be a journalist. You know, I thought it was cool. I'm a DJ and all that in high school. But I don't know. There was just, I was going to go to law school, and kind of ran out of money. And actually, to be honest, just ran out of desire to sit in a classroom when I graduated. And so I stayed in radio full time and became a radio news director. And then from there, Oh, I've worked as a news director for a radio station in Jonesboro, Arkansas, where I went to college, and then the local TV station. There was a local story that was getting a lot of traction, and I had a lot of insight on it, and I was breaking stuff about it just about every day. And they called me and said, "Hey, can you do that on TV?" And I did, and I fell in love with it all.
What was the story?
It was, well, just to boil it down to its essence, there was a lot of turmoil at the campus regarding the president of the university and some things that were going on there. And anyway, the president ended up resigning and being replaced. It was one of those kind of things. So I worked in Jonesboro 18 months, was a reporter, and then was their weekend anchor. And then I got a call from a station in Little Rock, and I went down to Little Rock and interviewed, and they hired me to be a reporter, primarily covering the Capitol and politics and some education. Anchored weekends for a while in Little Rock, but decided my ego did not require that I be on television. Frankly, I didn't think I was really all that good. I decided I wanted to do the management thing. So I started producing newscasts for them, and a steady stream of promotions. And before you know it, I'd worked in 14 states, and here I am.
How did you feel about being in front of the camera versus, kind of behind the scenes?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I hope that this doesn't sound too much, but when I was anchoring the news in Little Rock, I was the weekend anchor of a blowtorch NBC affiliate. I mean, we had huge numbers. And it got to a point where, I'm having dinner with my wife at Browning's Mexican restaurant in the heights of Little Rock, and, people would come over and want to talk, and which you want them to do that, but it just didn't fit with my personality, and it made me very uncomfortable. There's just no anonymity. There's no real privacy if you're on television, and it didn't, and my ego didn't require it. I mean, I didn't need adulation or appreciation or any of that, really. And so I just didn't want to do it anymore for that reason. My private life was much more important. So it's hard enough on a family in this business.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes people have the same pressures and stresses and angst sometimes that the people on air do, but, don't get a lot of the adulation or admiration or whatever. We operate mostly behind the scenes, and that's just fine with me.
I want to talk about how journalism has changed, and I want to kind of start with like those early moments where you started to really feel things shift.
In some ways it happened so gradually, it's almost hard to put a finger on it. But I will tell you that I think one of the primary things that dramatically changed everything in our business was when they eliminated the ownership limits on television and radio stations. When I first started in the business in 71, the rules were that one company could own 7 AM stations, 7 FM stations, 7 TV stations. That was it. And the Reagan administration was the first to change that, and they changed it to, if I'm remembering correctly, 12, 12, 12. And then from that, it went higher. And, now you can have, there's no limit on the number of stations that can be owned. There is a limit that is pretty regularly ignored that says you can only own stations that reach roughly 40% of the population. I think it's 39 and some change or something like that. And you can't, acquire stations if you would be having more influence than that. But I mean, here's the bottom line. You have 3 companies now that control it's probably not too much to say, they really kind of control local news in this country. Gray, Sinclair, Nexstar, they all own well in excess of 100 TV stations. And there's something fundamentally wrong that 3 companies could control. At one time I counted, it was like 560 local news operations being controlled by these 3 companies. And then you fold in Tegna, which has another 50-something, and Hearst, and, you have a very limited number of people with control of the message now. And it seemed that the more and more it became attractive for investors and the market to have broadcast properties and journalism properties, it seemed like the bumper guards started coming down more.
Yeah.
And, everybody started hiring consultants. Everybody's heard of the Frank Magid Company. That was one of the first big ones. And their sole purpose was to increase ratings. And you ended up with infotainment, A Current Affair was, Inside Edition, and all those shows came along later, but the first one was A Current Affair. And, it sensationalized everything, and you started feeling at first, subtle pressure to, jazz up the news and make it more interesting, and whiz bang, and lots of graphics. And, I don't know that we made anything more understandable. I think we made it faster and louder and brighter, but I don't know that we dramatically improved the quality of journalism. I do want to say that there are many stations who do quality work despite, this constant attention to the bottom line, constant attention to the ratings, but there's still really good work done. And, one of the reasons we find ourselves in the situation we're in now is I don't think we tended to our own knitting very well. Edward Murrow, who is, kind of the iconic broadcast journalist going back to World War II, started warning about this in the 1950s, made a famous speech to the Radio Television News Directors Association in Chicago that year, where he talked about what the box could be, not just a box full of lights, but, could be meaningful. And, and Murrow's work was meaningful. Joe McCarthy, he brought them down. That whole anti-American Activities Committee nonsense that we went through in the 50s. We're kind of going through a version of that now. There's somebody bad hiding under every rock. It's funny how history repeats itself.
Here's the Edward Murrow line that Perry's referencing.
This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and even it can inspire. But it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to those ends. Otherwise, it's nothing but wires and lights in a box. There is a great and perhaps decisive battle to be fought against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. This weapon of television could be useful.
Moving into the 1980s and 90s, Fox News and cable news network CNN changed the broadcast landscape.
It's really interesting. When CNN first started, it was like, how the hell are they going to be able to do that? Because you got to remember that when they first started, we didn't have all of this immense, technology, satellite technology, and the ability to instantly deliver news to any location.
Yeah.
So, we were in Little Rock, we were a CNN affiliate, which basically meant that if we were doing a story and they wanted it, they would pay us to take it out to Adams Field, put it on an airplane, and fly it to Atlanta. That's how it got done. And, they don't pay for it anymore. It's a much more, reciprocal kind of operation. Fox came along and they weren't even really seriously in the game at first. And then I guess they made a conscious decision to turn right. And that's when they started, growing. And, they bought up a bunch of television stations too. It wasn't just the network. And, some smart people in terms of audience manipulation uh, ran that company and still runs that company, But it changed the addition of 24-hour news cycles, infotainment, all the consultants whispering in the ears of, general managers and corporate people about how to make the ratings go up. All those things, resulted in a diminishing of credibility. And you got to have credibility. Truth matters.
Following that shift to a 24-hour news cycle, the gradual integration of the internet into daily life and journalism.
What I found most troubling was that it was like everybody knew the internet was going to be a big deal and then we needed to be in it somehow. But for a number of years, it was like everybody was just running around in the dark going, well, what do we do with this thing? And, smarter people than I am figured it out. And, the internet is a good thing. Some of the things that we've chosen to do with it, I think, are bad. Social media is the worst thing that ever happened to American democracy. And it could have been the best thing that ever happened to democracy. But, it's basically now a vehicle for outrageousness. I feel like I'm starting to sound like an old guy, crotchety old guy that doesn't want to accept the technologies. I accept the technologies. I don't accept the standards that they brought about. And I try to bring some old-fashioned values into what I continue to do. I mean, I haven't changed my opinion about right and wrong and how important what we do is and being relevant. And, we don't put meaningless house fires on the air. We don't chase every blue light that moves like a lot of television stations do. That was the other thing that happened too when, everything became about profit motive. You're trying to operate as cheaply as you could. And the cheapest and easiest thing to do in television news is just have a newscast full of fender benders and meaningless house fires and stupid stuff. And, you can go into just about any television market in the country and you'll find somebody doing that or chasing the blue lights. Well, that serves no purpose. It doesn't improve quality of life. And that, and that's purely driven by inadequate resources, because to do solid investigative reporting takes time, money, and an awful thick skin. Just even at our level, the stuff that we've done, it's not easy. Not easy at all.
Talk to me about, you talked about you feel like your values haven't changed. What is...
Well, let me say,
Yeah.
If anything, my journalism values, my solemn commitment that we should be demanding transparency and demanding accountability, and that our job is not just to preserve American democracy, it's to perfect it. That has grown stronger. Every year that I have done this, I have become more and more of a mind that we have got to have that feeling in our newsrooms in this country. We don't need a bunch of egos, or we don't need a bunch of people toadying up to people in power. We need people demanding that public officials do the public's work and communicate and be open and honest. And that is, in my heart, that is stronger now than it's ever been.
Has there been a decline in that kind of transparency over time?
I don't really know how to answer that. The history is full of all kinds of people who, I mean, you can go back to Huey Long in Louisiana. We've had all kinds of things happen in this country, happen in the media and all of that. So there are people that are good, well-intentioned public servants, but I think they're dramatically outnumbered by people who are in office for their own egos and their own, personal financial well-being. And that is not what we had in mind when we started all this stuff back in 1776. I don't really quite know how to say this. Government is supposed to flow from the towns and villages and farms and factories around America. That's where government is supposed to flow. The things that we believe, the things that we want for ourselves and for our children comes from our homes. It does not come from Washington, D.C. And we send people to Washington who somehow get caught up in this world that is a fantasy land for them. Why should my tax dollars, provide haircuts for them? We make our priorities are out of whack. We're supposed to be sending citizen politicians who go to Washington, do the job for their community, and they come back. They don't go up there and hang around for a million years. You can see it happen in history. In fact, it's probably always been this way. Everybody wants, you want to be the president, and, you're going to take whatever path you need to get there. But, the people just have got to stop being passive about this, or we're in for a declaration that the grand American experiment is failing. And that's heartbreaking to think like that. Absolutely heartbreaking. I have a 6-year-old grandson, and I want him to grow up in a world where we don't have elites that are privileged, that he can get the education he wants and needs, and that he can contribute meaningfully to, his community. And it's worrisome that may not be the world he is going to be moving into.
Talk to me about the importance of local news and local journalism.
Well, it all flows from back here, right?
Yeah.
You think about the stories that we've done here. I've been here 7 years now. I came here intended to be here for like 3 and retire, but I've been here for 7 now. And, I think we make a difference here. I don't think there's a public official in this area who isn't aware that we're demanding transparency here. We're demanding accountability. And if you think that by not being forthcoming with the media is the way to go, to just stonewall everything, I think we pretty much proved to people, well, you can do that, and we're going to report that that's exactly what you're doing. And that tends to annoy folks. So, I think that we've contributed here to more transparency from people, from government officials, some more so than others. And I don't want to paint a picture that there are not really good public officials, because there are. There are public servants. And that's what we need, not public officials. We need public servants. And we do have some of those people, and I'm not going to name them, the ones that I feel that way about, because I'd forget and leave somebody out.
We got to keep on their toes too.
Yeah, well, yeah, you got to keep them on your toes, keep them on their toes. But, I think those folks are, maybe a little bit more outnumbered by the people who just have a disdain for the media, and, social media has contributed to that a lot. There's always, people are constantly bashing us about something. And, I say, you got a problem with the truth? We're not making this stuff up. So, I don't know. Fewer people are going into this business because it is thankless work and it doesn't pay that much. And if you're not satisfied in your own soul by doing the right thing, maybe you're inclined to do something a little bit more financially rewarding. There's a misconception, I think, that people have, that particularly in, small to medium market journalism, that we're all, driving around in Mercedes-Benz and, we're big stars on TV and all that stuff. And, that's about as far from the truth as you can get. It doesn't pay that much. And most people that do this do it because they love it. And they have a sense that what they do matters. And, that's enough for some people. But fewer and fewer people are getting into this. Academia is pretty complicit in all of this too, because, I don't think that they're equipping kids with what they need to be able to do this job. Every time I bring a subject up, somebody will point to somebody and say, well, what about so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so? To which I would reply, okay, good. You just named 3 top quality people who I admire immensely. Now, what about the rest of these folks? We got to be realistic here. And there's a lot that needs to be fixed. And it's not getting fixed right now.
For you, I mean, your career now is roughly 50 years. What has kept you, why come back to local news? Why stay in these smaller local markets?
Well, because, I worked in St. Louis and Nashville, Las Vegas, and Birmingham, and Oklahoma City. Bigger markets, Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, Michigan, 30s, 40s markets, a couple of, top 20s. And, I think it happened more in the bigger markets. It became so much about profit and whiz bang. And, I just, that's not who I am. I'd rather be able to have the ability to make meaningful change somewhere than, I mean, I walked away from some stuff that people think I'm crazy, but, you got to be able to live with yourself, right? I mean, I just think you can make more of a difference in a market like a Paducah, or, I ran a couple of 2 newsrooms, ABC and NBC in Peoria for a while. I ran one in South Bend, Indiana, Columbus, Georgia. You can have more of an influence. The mayor knows who you are and knows who your reporters are, and the stories you're doing clearly affect people in their real lives. It's not abstract. When we write about the mayor, I know the mayor knows me. I think it just makes a difference if you're reporting about where you live. And that's another problem with the business too. The way it's set up is to make the best living you can make in this business. You're on this constant trek to the next size market.
Yeah.
And because the money gets better, the benefits get better, blah, blah, blah. And all that is true, but the intimacy of living diminishes because you never really know about the place. You're there for 3 years and you're on to the next thing. And I was doing that for quite a while. Now, a couple of times, I left places because they didn't want me to be there anymore, and that's fine. Um, but I just that system is messed up. We should be growing people. You should be able to make a living, a good enough living that you don't feel this constant need to do better, to do better, to do better.
How can people support local journalism?
Well, demanding that it stand up and do its job, and stop yelling. I mean, people need to have conversations with each other. It amazes me sometimes the crap people will say on the internet in a post that they wouldn't say to your face. I mean, it's just cowardly. And we don't need that. If you have a meaningful contribution to make, then do it in a civil, meaningful way. It doesn't always have to be, oh, you assholes on the news. The vast majority of people that I have met in this business are good and decent people who care deeply about what they do, and they understand its importance. The core people in this business. And we are not all trying to do a hit job on everybody. I don't know anybody, frankly, that really likes, doing a hit job. And to characterize holding somebody in public life accountable for their deeds and words and actions is the right thing to do. That should be something that people celebrate, not that they throw brickbats at. And there's way too much of, doing and saying things that put media people, journalists in danger, really. And that's just so unnecessary. Well, I don't want to be overtly political here, but when Trump acts the way Trump acts, he creates an environment where people lash out at the media and hate the media. And, I can speak for this news organization. We're interested in telling the truth. And if you lie, you lied. And if we call that out, you should thank us for calling out that it was a lie. Don't beat us up for calling out that it's a lie. And, it takes willpower and determination to do this. At the local level, we do a story that someone will say is negative. It creates unnecessary roadblocks to the truth.
What's the role of a journalist?
Preserve and protect and perfect democracy. That's the role of a journalist. It's the only job that is protected by the Constitution of the United States. The only one. All that other stuff in there about the president, the vice president, all that, that's all technical mechanics of how stuff works. But freedom of the press, which belongs to all Americans, but freedom of the press protects journalists. There's not dentists don't have something like that. Taxi cab drivers don't have that. Doctors don't have that. It's important work. And I mean, I frankly just can't imagine what's happening is happening. You got a Supreme Court who, is clearly a political faction now. They're not wise men, handing down the Pentagon Papers case or New York Times versus Sullivan or any of the great rulings they made before. And that is not good for the country. This is not good for the country. We need to get our act together. The role of a journalist is to point out, hey, if we keep doing that, we're going to screw this up. and the response to that shouldn't be, well, shut the F up. It should be, oh, yeah, okay.
I want to end this episode by reading from a note that Perry shared with me ahead of our conversation. It's dated March 10th, 2020. He writes, quote, "Journalism is a calling. I know this to be true. So does every journalist whose soul burns brightly with the sure and certain knowledge that truth matters. Free people do not fear truth, but demand it. To speak truth to power, to probe, investigate, demand transparency, carefully analyze what may be masquerading as fact, chronicle the events of our time in the context of what has been and may yet come, to report fairly, freely, fearlessly for the sake of justice, truth, equality, foundational American values, and the perfection and preservation of democracy is a calling, nothing less. It is a calling from which you cannot resign or retire without betraying the essence of yourself." Thank you for listening.